But in Alaska, very quickly, right, Orthodox Christianity was the indigenous religion of the indigenous peoples, of particularly the Aleuts, as well as Yupiks and Tlinkits, and even Athabascans along the Kuskokwim Delta and the Yukon Delta, because of the way Orthodox Christian missionaries carried and presented the Orthodox Christian faith.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian Podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Father James Hargrave. And for anyone listening or watching, Father James, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you spend your time doing?
Good morning, Max. I am Father James Hargrave. I'm a priest in the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America. I'm the interim priest at St. Joseph the Damascene Antiochian Orthodox Church in Delta, BC. We are a kind of pan-Arabic congregation, people from all over the Middle East, from Iraq to Sudan and everywhere in between. So I spend a fair amount of my time serving the divine services and pastoring the people in all the various ways that happens. However, I also spend a great deal of my time working for the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, which is the missionary sending agency for all of the jurisdictions of the Orthodox Church here in North America. I am a missionary specialist in the Liturgical Translation Program. My particular role in the Liturgical Translation Program of OCMC is training translators. So people all over the world who are translating the worship of the Orthodox Church into their own native languages. I am writing textbooks and training programs and preparing to deliver these programs either online or in person, depending on the particular situation of the translator, to train people to translate the Orthodox Christian liturgy, the worship of our God, into the language that their people can worship from their hearts.
That's really interesting. And with that work, are there certain areas that the missionary group is focusing on at this time in terms of sending out missionaries to these locales?
You talking about geographical areas?
Yeah, geographically.
Well, OCMC, I don't have the stats with me, but we have long-term missionaries right now in Guatemala and Albania and Romania, and in the Pacific, I don't have these stats in front of me, the island of Fiji. And I may be forgetting some places. However, we also partner with local Orthodox churches around the world. I served as a long-term missionary with OCMC in Tanzania in East Africa for several years. And I do speak Swahili, which is the trade language of East Africa. There are close to 200 different languages in East Africa, but Swahili is the one that people use to communicate with each other. So a lot of my focus is on Swahili and East Africa. Right now, we have the Liturgical Translation Program. We have some work going on in Guatemala. We have a missionary, Jesse Brando, who is part of our team living and working in Guatemala. And we are preparing for a partnership with the Archdiocese of Nairobi in Kenya for training liturgical translators. They have a vigorous liturgical translation program, and they've asked for our support. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful for everyone listening. So, Father James, tell us a little bit about your religious upbringing and how you eventually encountered the Orthodox Church.
Yeah. My parents are evangelical Protestants. They are missionaries. They retired last year, but then my mother unretired to take on another role. So I can say that they're still Protestant missionaries. And I grew up in Kenya in East Africa. I moved there when I was 3, and I left when I was 18. And after I graduated high school, I left to start university in the States. So I was raised in a very active evangelical Protestant household, in very active evangelical Protestant churches in Africa. And when I was 10, I believe, I was 10, we lived in northern Kenya, close to the Ethiopian border. And in the early 90s, there was a civil war going on in Ethiopia. And we had a lot of refugees come down, and they were mostly young men from the cities who were fleeing the draft in the Civil War. So like teenagers, like 15-year-old boys. And of course, they were Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. And that's when getting to know some of these refugees, of course, as a 10-year-old, I didn't really understand war and all this stuff. I just thought it was really cool that these cool teenagers wanted to hang out with me. And discovering that they, not only were they Christians, but that their ancestors had been Christians when my ancestors were worshiping trees, just kind of blew my mind. And so that was the first I ever heard about any kind of Christianity other than evangelical Protestantism in any sense. Later on, when I studied Kenyan history, I learned about the very significant role that the Orthodox Church in Kenya played in the 1930s and 40s and 50s during the Kenyan independence movement. So that was kind of the first I ever heard about Orthodox Christianity. When I started university in the US, I was in Florida, and there's a lot of culture shock and a lot of kind of questioning and second guessing parts of my upbringing, things I had learned, particularly learning more about African history, the history of colonialism, and how much the Western missionary movement was allied with colonialism really, really shocked me and disillusioned me. And I became very uncomfortable with Christianity in general. Fast forward to my 3rd year of university, my junior year, I was studying Russian because at my university you had to pick a language, and of the choices, Russian seemed the coolest. And that was about the extent of it. But I got to study abroad. I got to spend 8 months living in Moscow. This was in 2002. And it so happened that my dormitory window overlooked a church, which isn't surprising. It's not hard to find a church in Moscow. And I had a professor, she was like my advisor at the university there in Moscow, who was a very humble, very faithful Orthodox Christian, very soft-spoken, and a wonderful educator. And she, she encouraged any interest I had because she was there to teach me Russian. And when she saw that I was, had a missionary background, she happily taught me anything I wanted to learn about Russian religion. And it came to the point where my other professors were all kind of indifferent, agnostic, atheists, unchurched, non-religious, and they were telling me all kinds of wild things about Orthodox Christianity. Like they said, during Lent, like they don't eat anything for 40 days. And then they have this thing called Pascha where they stay up all night until sunrise. And I was 21 and I thought, well, that sounds cool. Let me check that out. So I went to the church for this Pascha, right, Easter, for this midnight service, the church I could see from my dorm window. And I was kind of disappointed when everybody went home by 4 a.m. because I'd been, I thought it was supposed to be all night long. And that was that weekend was, my first encounter with Orthodox Christian worship. And what I found there was people who were behaving like they were in the presence of God. Now, as a child in rural northern Kenya, we lived with a people group called the Rendile and the Samburu. There were two different people groups in the same village. And at the time I was growing up, neither of them had the Bible translated into their own language. So on the one hand, I was being raised in a faith that taught me, as I understood it, that the way I can encounter God is by reading the Bible. Right? That's how I encounter God, is I read the Bible. And all the other stuff, going to church, all the other stuff is kind of peripheral. And, the point is read the Bible on the one hand. And on the other hand, I was surrounded by people who were actually unable to read the Bible because the Bible had not been written in their language. So there's a cognitive dissonance there, which isn't to say that the local evangelical church wasn't doing wonderful things in the community, and isn't to say that there aren't lots of ways to make the Christian faith accessible to people who can't read the Bible. But it was still this, hang on, Christianity is all about reading the Bible so that you connect to God by reading the Bible. But there's all these people around me who can't read the Bible, so they can't connect to God. Fast forward again to standing in that church, which I later discovered was the cathedral of the Donskoy Monastery. And I knew Russian, but the liturgy was happening in Church Slavonic, and it was very, very rapid, and I couldn't understand the words. But I was surrounded by people who knew that they were in the presence of God, and they were acting like it. And I knew that I was in the presence of God. And it was this epiphany of, oh, this is how you encounter God, right? It's not about what you read. It's about where you are, who you're with, what you do, right? What all parts of you, including what you read, are part of your relationship with God. But the direct encounter with God is not in private reading and intellectual exercise. It's in public worship. I can articulate that now, but that's the sense I had at that moment. So that was my encounter with Orthodox Christianity. Now I'm trying to remember your question because I've been talking for a long time. Have I finished answering your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. So I want to drill down into a few different sections there.
All right.
First of all, if you can tell us a little bit about growing up in, was it North Kenya, you said?
Yeah, in Kenya.
Okay.
Mostly northern Kenya as well as western Kenya.
So if you can tell us a little bit about what life was like there, just in a day-to-day sense, but then more specifically in terms of what being a Christian at that time looked like for you in a very concrete sense. So what did the church service look like? What did piety at home look like? If you can just walk us through that, I think that'd be really helpful.
Sure. It depends on by age 12, I was at boarding school and boarding school for missionary kids. So that looked very different from the rural village in northern Kenya. But in Logologo, in the Kaisut Desert of northern Kenya, church on a Sunday morning would last for, I want to say 3 or 4 hours. Everything would be translated into multiple languages. They would use Swahili, which is the national language, and then everything would be translated both into Samburu and into Rendile. And there would be singing and music in one language or another. Usually the only musical instruments were like tambourines or triangles. But I mean, my memory as a child was a lot of like sitting on a wooden bench bored. Because somebody was preaching in a language I couldn't understand, and it was being translated into 2 more languages I couldn't understand. And, the worship was mostly in 3 languages I couldn't understand. So that was my experience when I was young. The being a Christian in that society, it was very interesting. There were, especially to this day, the Rendile people. There are many people who still practice their traditional religion. They're a nomadic people group, and especially with nomads who are, live on the very edge of survival, there's this really ingrained, deeply held belief that what keeps us alive is sticking to our traditions and not changing anything. And I mean, they survive and even thrive in places where other people would die. So, they really do have a unique way of surviving and thriving in what to you or to me is a hostile wilderness. And the Rendile people, their traditional religion looks a lot like Judaism. They keep kosher, looks a lot like the Judaism of the wandering in the wilderness, right? They keep kosher. They have essentially a Passover festival that they celebrate 4 times a year, which includes slaughtering an unblemished goat and sprinkling the blood on doorposts, among other things. And so one reason they're very resistant to converting to Christianity or Islam is because when they start hearing stories from the Bible, right, what they say is, yeah, we know that. You're not telling us anything new. What do you have for us, right, that we don't already have? And so the people who converted to Christianity, my parents were kind of the second generation of missionaries in that area, and the Christians their age were mostly the first generation of Christians in that area, and Christians were still quite a minority. Most people practiced traditional religion or were Muslim, and from our point of view, if you were Catholic, you were not Christian. That's what I grew up understanding. Right, there are Christians, there are Catholics, there are Muslims, and there is traditional religion. Those are the religions. So becoming a Christian meant, in that culture, it meant totally changing the clothes that you wore. Now, this isn't what my parents taught people. This is what the previous generation of missionaries had taught people. And this is what people told my parents must be done. Like I remember my mother telling me about one of the first weddings they witnessed there in northern Kenya, church weddings. And that was a big deal to have a church wedding instead of the traditional wedding. You're really scandalizing your family by not having a traditional wedding. And then the church wedding had all these details that were very important. This is what Christians do, the kind of gloves the bride wears, all kinds of things that were just, my mother was like, I haven't seen this except in like movies about Victorian England, but this is what Christians do. Okay. And there was, among the evangelicals, there's this very strong sense that if you become a Christian, you have to just be really totally separated from your traditional culture, right, including even things like clothing, among other things. So I grew up kind of surrounded by a community of people who, for the sake of following Christ, had really been asked to separate themselves and distance themselves from their own culture and instead adopt some kind of Western culture, right? It seemed very Victorian to my family. It wasn't the kind of Western culture that we knew, but it was a very, I don't know, it was very not indigenous, not local. I've lost my train of thought again. Have I answered your
That's
question
good.
or?
No, that's really helpful, I think,
Yeah.
and we may come back to that later. So
Yeah.
another question I had with your story is then you came to North America, you went to school in the
Mhm.
States, and you mentioned it was a culture shock. So two questions that emerge from that. One is how was it different living in
Mhm.
the States after growing up in North Kenya?
Mhm.
And a second question to mix in is you started to learn about colonialism at school, a lot of challenges to
Mhm.
Christianity because of how closely it was associated, particularly with the missionary movement that you just described.
Yeah.
And how did you overcome that?
Oh, I don't know if I overcame that. What I can say is that when I encountered Orthodox Christianity in Russia, it was certainly very Russian. It was certainly very not Western. Um, but it was clear to me that if the encounter with God is through worship, that just changes the paradigm about everything else, right? Of course, as I would later learn, um, in the Orthodox Church, we have ethics and morality, and we have some rules. Um, the polygamous society that I grew up in, a man is not allowed to marry multiple women, to be married to multiple women at the same time in the Orthodox Church, right? There are certainly in any culture, there are things in that culture that you have to resist or you have to confront if you're going to be a faithful Christian. But Orthodox Christianity, just my encounter with it, especially when I encountered it in Russia, having already known Orthodox Christians in Kenya who were Ethiopians, having read about the Kenyan Orthodox Church, which started out as a completely indigenous movement, right? I was aware that Orthodox Christianity was just it was a different paradigm. It was a different way of encountering God, a different way of dealing with culture and with the world. So that was a revelation, um, to kind of start to concretely see, oh, this is how you be a Christian without that same kind of colonial baggage. Right, and I want to be careful with that because Orthodox Christian empires have definitely been known to colonize, right? That has definitely happened, and particularly the Russian Empire, was very interested for a while in Russifying indigenous peoples. So, I don't want to be too dramatic about that. At the same time, if we look at the history of the Orthodox Christian missionary movement in North America, and you compare that to the Protestant missionary movement in North America among indigenous peoples, or even the Roman Catholics, although the Roman Catholics in general um, were more culturally sensitive than the Protestants. But in Alaska, very quickly, right, Orthodox Christianity was the indigenous religion of the indigenous peoples, of particularly the Aleuts, as well as Yupiks and Tlinkits, and even Athabascans along the Kuskokwim Delta and the Yukon Delta, because of the way Orthodox Christian missionaries presented the Orthodox Christian faith, not as something where you leave your culture behind to become a Christian, but rather Christ enters your culture and is at the very heart of your culture. And there's a really sharp contrast when you see the Protestant missionaries move in once Alaska became part of the US and set up residential schools and try to take people's language away, take their clothing away, take their culture away, and impose like Christianity instead of your culture. Where a lot of those very indigenous people were already worshiping God, worshiping Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in their indigenous language. They were practicing faithful Christians and without being divorced from their culture, right? Christ was at the heart of their culture. So you see a really strong contrast between those things in Alaska in particular. However, as I later began studying the history and theology of the Orthodox Christian missionary movement, while we definitely have our major egregious sins, for sure, the theology and very often the practice, is not colonial, is very different.
That's a wonderful comparison to make. So going forward now, you've encountered, just returning to your story, you've encountered the Orthodox Church in Russia, and it's intriguing to you. You feel like God is truly there. This is the way one ought to act when in God's presence. There's something attractive about the actual gestures or symbolism and what have you of the gathering of believers or Christians. What takes you from just being intrigued from it to actually joining Orthodoxy?
It's a good question. At the time, I'd been studying Russian history, and I mean, just like any world history, Russian history is pretty awful. And just like anywhere in the world, Christians and church leaders have very much been part of that awfulness. So I had a pretty low opinion of Orthodox Christians. And I was a well-educated young man, and I was too intelligent to believe these silly, superstitious things that Christians believe, like the virgin birth and the incarnation and all that. That was my attitude. And also, I had encountered the presence of God, and I knew where to go to be in the presence of God. And because the worship was totally unintelligible, for quite a while, I could keep up this, these two totally incompatible ideas. One, what Christians believe is false. Two, when I encounter Orthodox Christian worship, I am in the presence of God, right? And I kept that up for a while. And then I moved back to the US, and I wanted to keep going to worship in Orthodox churches. And so I was in Central Florida at the time, and this was 2003, fall of 2002, and then winter and spring of 2003. So, the internet existed, but it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is now. So I mostly just stumbled upon churches. Like, I had more success finding churches by driving around looking for cupolas than I did going online. And then actually an Orthodox priest was invited to speak in one of my classes, and that's how I found out about his church, which turned out to be the closest church to my university and was in the OCA. So they worshiped in English, but they used the kind of music that I had encountered in Russia, and there were Russian speakers I could chat with. And so that's where I ended up attending regularly. And after about 4 or 5 months, one day I'm standing in the liturgy singing, I believe in one God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven. Hang on, wait a minute. Do I believe this? No, I don't believe this. Can I worship God without singing this creed? Well, yes, you could say it instead of singing it, but no, this actually is the worship, right? The being in the presence of God, participating in that worship is the faith, is the belief. These things are not separate. And, confronted with that, I kind of realized, okay, I have to make a decision here. In good faith, I can't continue coming to the Orthodox Church and believing I'm in the presence of God if I am not willing to entertain the possibility that the beliefs being expressed in the worship are real. And I started with, I was 21, going on 22. I started with And I was like, all right, I'm going to study this issue exhaustively and decide what the truth is. Starting with the virgin birth, right? And, after a lot of, studying, what I came down to was I'm a well-educated young man. If I want to make a case, if I want to make an argument for or against the virgin birth, I can do that, right? I can totally come up with arguments that I find convincing for or against. Okay. And I was, kind of unhappy and lost young man. And these arguments, didn't really help me get along with my roommates or, help me live a better life in any way. On the other hand, in the church, right, we confess that Jesus was born of a virgin. And in the church, I'm learning how to get along with my roommates, right? How to be less self-centered, how to love others. I'm seeing changes in myself the more I'm participating in the church. So, if we're keeping it at the level of what arguments do I find convincing, I can kind of convince myself of anything. But if we turn it to what way of life is holy, what way of life it transforms me, what way of life is pointed towards God, right then it was pretty clear that any way of life I could invent for myself was just not it. And who the church is, by then I'd been 8 or 9 months attending Orthodox services, and who the church is, that's something. So after a few more things, virgin birth, the incarnation, I forget what else, I kind of stopped doing that. I said, all right, I'm in. I'm ready now. I'm ready not to decide what I believe. Now I'm ready to learn. Now I'm ready to be catechized, to be taught. So that's when I became a catechumen. That was the middle of Great Lent in 2003. And I was getting ready to graduate in a few months, and I was moving to South Korea to teach English. And my priest, when I told my priest I asked to become a catechumen, he told me, of course, welcome. Normally, we like to catechize you for about a year and then receive you into the faith. He said, but since you're about to leave the country, I think it's better for you to become an Orthodox Christian and then leave the country and find an Orthodox church where you're going. So in my last month and a half of university, I did a whirlwind catechesis and was received into the church. Since I had been baptized by immersion in water in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit when I was 15, I was received into the church through the sacrament of chrismation. And a few weeks later, I moved to South Korea and started participating in the wonderful Korean Orthodox Church, where I really received the bulk of my catechesis in the Korean Orthodox Church, even though I had already been received into the church. And that was the beginning. That was 20 years ago. And what I can tell you is that being an Orthodox Christian is no more or less than being a Christian, right? I'm convinced that the Orthodox Church is the church. And so to follow Christ means to follow Christ as a participant and a member of the Orthodox Church. But what it is it's being a Christian, it's following Christ, right? That's what it is. And, 20 years ago, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I knew that, but I was committed, and, now as a priest in the Orthodox Church. I still have no idea what I've gotten myself into. But this is where life is. This is where Jesus Christ is. And I do have 20 years of experience of saying, there's just nothing else than to follow Christ. There's nothing better. There's nothing real other than to follow the Lord. So here we are.
So I'm going to try to summarize some of that, and you can let me know if it's accurate or not.
All
So
right.
you grew up in North Kenya, missionary kid. Then you came over to the States. You went to college and encountered some critical theories about colonialism and its collusion and union with some of the Western missionary movements, which essentially disenchanted you and made you really question or even at times reject some of the things that you'd been brought up with. You, as part of that schooling, went over to Russia, happened to encounter an Orthodox church, started going, and really found the worship experience profound and moving and beneficial, though you didn't yet hold the tenets of the faith, the creeds and so forth, as valid. Then you came back to the States. You wanted to continue going to an Orthodox church. Now all of a sudden it was in English, and so you could comprehend the actual words of the liturgy, and really were faced with this problem of, well, I enjoy this, however, I don't actually believe what's being spoken about now, and had to face it at that point. And as you faced it and wrestled with these questions, you found that there's arguments for, there's arguments against. You can kind of go either way just from a purely rational perspective, but when you considered what it was doing in your life in terms of helping you to lead a better life, you found that those creeds and what have you have a quality of truth about them. In other words, that Christ says you shall know a tree by its fruit, and you could see that the fruit of going to this church was beneficial, and then by faith or through trust, you decided to cooperate and accept the higher level beliefs because you could see on the lower level in terms of the ethics and so forth that it was trustworthy. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
Okay. So from there, you became a priest. I mean, it wasn't like immediate, I assume, but if you can just bridge that gap as a summary of how you converted and then to where you are today, what kind of happened in that period?
Sure. Goodness. I spent a year in South Korea teaching English and kind of learning to be an Orthodox Christian in the Korean Orthodox Church. Then I spent a year in Southern California volunteering with Catholic Charities in the inner city, and was a member of a local Antiochian Orthodox parish, and there saw another side of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to follow Christ in hard places. Right, I'd grown up in a hard place. When I was a kid, there was a famine, and there were people who starved to death around me. But I was a kid, and as an adult, working full time to serve people who were in desperate situations, that was a new reality for me. And we were there to do what we could to help, but there's only so much that you can do, right? Someone comes in with all kinds of problems, and like, all right, well, let's see. If you lived in this zip code, you might qualify for this program, but you don't live in the zip code. Okay, well, here's what we can do for you. Sack lunch, right, and a listening ear. Then sometimes, right, for some people you could do more, but in all of that, this was Catholic Charities, and there was a crucifix on the wall behind me, and coming to realize that, all right, what I'm doing is I'm following Jesus. Right? I'm following Jesus into hard places because he's there. And of course, I'm doing what I can to help. And I'm realizing how little I can do to help. And so mostly I'm just following Jesus. Right? Jesus is here, so I want to be here. And that was, that was a call to long-term, full-time Christian ministry in some shape or form. I knew that, but I didn't know what shape or form it would be. I was born in Gainesville, Florida, in North Florida, and that's where my family's from. My grandparents were both alive at the time, living on the family farm out there. And so I moved back there to study linguistics in graduate school at the University of Florida, mostly because I wanted to live in my hometown. And studying getting a master's in linguistics was a way to do that. And I like languages. After about 5 years there, I got to know more and more the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, which is based in St. Augustine, Florida, just down the road from Gainesville. The children of the executive director of OCMC were fellow students. We were part of the Orthodox Christian Fellowship together. I got to know a lot of staff at the Orthodox Christian Mission Center. In fact, the missionary director was our chaplain for our student Orthodox Christian Fellowship at the university. And, every now and then they would say to me, hey, if you want to be an OCMC missionary, we got a place for you. We could use you in Tanzania. And, I'm studying linguistics, knowing that I want to spend my life in full-time Christian ministry, not sure what direction to take, what that means. Ask myself, okay, how do I know when God is calling me? And what it finally came down to was, well, sometimes it's a phone call, right, from someone you trust who says, you could serve God this way, will you? And so in 2010, I did deploy as a long-term missionary to Tanzania after about a year of fundraising. And I've been with OCMC. I still am with OCMC ever since. I served in Tanzania for 3 years. I had already met the woman who would become my wife when I was raising support. But Daphne came to Tanzania on a short-term trip, medical trip, because she was considering becoming a long-term missionary. And we fell in love and got married and returned to the field together. Our son was born on the field. And it became apparent that, I was being asked to teach theology to clergy a lot. And if I'm going to teach theology to clergy, I really should study theology first, please. So we eventually left the field so that I could go to seminary. And I did go to seminary. We lived in Boston for 3 years, studied at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology for the purpose of returning to East Africa, not for the purpose of ordination, but for the purpose of returning to East Africa and being able to share everything I'd learned with the local priests. At the end of that time, this is now fall of 2019, we came back to British Columbia to fundraise in preparation for moving to East Africa. The plan was that we were going to move to Kenya in March of 2020. But there were some health issues that came up, and those health issues have and will prevent us from living overseas long term. So that was the time when I became part of the liturgical translation team, which, by the way, all my education had prepared me for. It's a really good fit. And it's work that I can do. It's work I can be based anywhere in the world to do this work and travel as needed. And so in all of that, I was asked to accept ordination as a deacon because there was a need at the church I was assisting in New England, in Boston. And so I accepted it and served as a deacon for about 5 years. And then just a few months ago, I was asked to accept ordination as a priest because of a need at the church here in British Columbia, where I've been serving since 2019. And I accepted that, and I'm able to fill that need right now.
Mm.
So I think that brings us up to date.
Yeah, that's up to the present. So,
Yeah.
when you did mention some challenges when you first encountered Orthodoxy in terms of the actual creedal statements and the
Mhm.
foundation of belief versus, say, just the ethics or the beauty and wonder of the worship services. Were there other challenges that you initially encountered or had to face along the way as an Orthodox Christian?
Um, there's a daycare upstairs. I don't know if you can hear it. I mean, the big challenge the big challenge was and continues to be and always will be myself. That's really it. You know, my own, you know, my own selfishness, my own um, sin, right? I mean, that's the challenge in following Christ. There's incidental things, but the real challenge in following Christ is being willing to be transformed, being willing to be changed, and then being patient, because God doesn't transform, at least He hasn't ever transformed me by just suddenly changing me in a dramatic way, right? Oh, I had this failure that I constantly battled with. I asked God to help me, and He took it away. I don't have that problem anymore. That's never happened to me. Instead, what happens is the struggle, right? And that's where life is. That's where the Holy Spirit is. That's where grace is in that struggle, in that day-to-day struggle of, and it's not even. It turns out it's not even about changing, right? It's not I want to change. It's I want to be. I want to be with Christ. And I find myself being changed as I'm with Christ, and I have to accept that. And I even have to work very hard on that. I mean, thank God I was young, I was in college. My parents are faithful Christians. I hadn't been going to church. Suddenly I'm going to church again. My parents are living on the other side of the world. They're thrilled, right? They'd be even more thrilled if it had been an evangelical church, but they saw me following Jesus. They were happy about it. So in terms of family, nothing but support. Thank God. Within the church, the biggest challenge is myself, right? There's along the way, there's there's always, people don't live up to our calling, and sometimes that can really feel like betrayal. Sometimes it is betrayal, and that can be really hard, and it can be scandalous and scandalizing. But there's never been any bigger obstacle than my own self.
Mm. Mm. It reminds me of when Jacob encounters God and they wrestle, and that's
Mhm.
literally the definition of Israel. Or I think too about Christ and the disciples on the lake and the storm that comes upon them, and then Christ calms the storm. So it just seems like that's kind of a persistent theme, or even like the Israelites wandering through the desert, that following God doesn't save you from the struggles, but it's through the struggles that you are saved and you actually come
Yeah.
closer to Him.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think you have a unique perspective growing up as a missionary
Mhm.
kid and then later being a missionary. And it sounds from your story that you have, and even with the work that you're currently doing, a strong emphasis on having God's people worship in their mother tongue, being able to communicate and
Absolutely.
understand things. Now, that's not always the case in Orthodoxy. Sometimes when people come in, they have a temptation almost to
Mhm.
want to become very Eastern and just jettison their Western upbringing or sensibilities. And what would you have to say to that unique issue? Because I think you'd be a good one to speak about that.
Yeah. In general, so just take it easy. Take it easy, breathe, pray, right? That's the important thing, right? Pray, say your prayers. Now, I mean, our Lord Jesus Christ is at the heart of human culture and of every particular culture and every particular language. So you don't have to become Serbian or Arabic or Greek or Russian in order to follow Jesus, right? But if you want to learn Serbian or Arabic or Greek or Russian, and if you like some of the cultural things and you want to do that yourself, nothing wrong with that. And sometimes, right? Sometimes there are people who feel like it's easier for me to find my way to following Jesus in this particular community if I try to adopt some of the customs and the language of this particular community, right? Because a congregation is a body of people. The congregation I serve now is, other than me, is basically 100% Arabic. That's a very diverse community, right? An Arab from Iraq and an Arab from Sudan are very different in a lot of ways. But if in a particular community you feel like the best way I can find forward to following Christ is to take on some of the characteristics of this particular group of particular people, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Right. But Christ is at the heart of every culture, right? You don't have to become something other than who you are. You don't have to become some other kind of human being, some other kind of culture than the one that's yours in order to find Christ and to follow him. Yeah. And this can go both ways, right? There can also be people who kind of feel like, I'm coming into the church and now I have to change it, right? I have to make it accommodate me more. And again, take it easy, right? On the one hand, if you can't have any catechism or pastoral guidance in a language you can understand, right, that's a practical problem. And that problem needs to be confronted and managed for sure, right? And so the church does need to accommodate you in some way. On the other hand, right, it's not all about me, right? And I'm part of, right, when you become a Christian, you become part of a particular community. You become a part of a particular congregation that has its characteristics and has its limitations, right? We're the body of Christ, but we don't have infinite cosmic powers, right? Every congregation can't do all the things. And the point of being a Christian isn't to be accommodated. And so, again, take it easy. It's not wrong to ask for help, right? It's not wrong to ask for accommodation in different kinds of ways. But take it easy, right? What needs to be changed is nothing other than my own heart, right? And if my own heart is transformed, all this other stuff won't get in the way of my heart being transformed. Of course, I am very committed, as you find throughout the history of Orthodox Christianity in particular, very committed to giving people the opportunity to worship God in language that is intelligible to them. Deep prayer, the prayer of the heart, is beyond language, is beyond words. Right, but to get there, to get beyond the words, you have to go through the words. And being able to worship God, to give God that offering of praise, of intelligible, rational worship, is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a helpful note. So to be able to communicate effectively with people, so they understand. It sounds like also to have some sort of appreciation for what is good in the culture already, and that's sort of what you highlighted with the Alaskan missionaries, where they were able to connect with the indigenous people and affirm and come alongside what was already there, and see how God was leading those people through these things rather than just whitewashing it or
Yeah.
totally rejecting it as something that is completely wrong. So it sounds kind of, let me know if this is accurate, but it sounds like with Orthodoxy, um, it's less of a dichotomy in terms of its missionary work, that it's less of a dichotomy of like this culture is right, this culture is wrong, and it is more of a continuum where you have different approximations of the truth, that things can be further or closer, but you're not just rejecting them outright because it's a foreign culture. Is that a way that you would characterize it, or perhaps you have a different way?
Yeah, let's see. In terms of Orthodox evangelism and missionary work, first of all, let me be clear that Orthodox Christian evangelists and missionaries have been known to make huge mistakes, right? You can definitely find lots of evidence of Orthodox Christian missionaries going somewhere and saying, your culture is bad, you need to become our culture, right? That totally has happened. It totally still happens. So I don't want to paint this idealistic, perfect picture. On the other hand, the theology of the church and the authentic missionary witness of the church, I said Christ is at the heart of human culture. He's at the heart of every culture, and I don't know that I'd speak of a continuum, but I would say that whatever your culture is, or however kind of culturally dislocated you might feel, Christ can reach your heart, and you do not have to change your language, your clothing, your cuisine, right? And even much more kind of detailed cultural practices, right? I mean, read the all like the New Testament after the Gospels is so much about this, right? How much do we have to change culturally in order to follow Jesus? And the decision basically is, well, you're not allowed to worship anyone who isn't Jesus, right? That's kind of it. Um, that's kind of it. Whether you want to keep circumcision, whether you want to reject circumcision, up to you, right? All kinds of these other details. You can, as a culture, you can keep certain dietary restrictions or not, right? All this stuff, right? But you have to worship Jesus and no one else. Right? You have to worship Jesus and no one else. And that impacts the way you live your life, right? Of course, marriage is a big theme, both in kind of becoming a Christian. What does that mean about marriage, about sexuality, about how we relate to other people, right? It changes the way we live in the world. And that will scandalize every culture. Western culture, right? We have this idea of like that Western culture is, I don't know, based on Christianity or something. But I mean, you find scandalous stuff in Western culture that has always been there, right? There's certainly stuff today, right? A certain kind of consumerism and greed that seems post-Christian. But there are other parts of Western culture that have always been opposed to the gospel and still persist, right? Were there before the gospel came and still persist to this day and have always been wrong and have sometimes been preached against. Um,
Do you have examples that
so,
you're thinking of right now?
I would have to think more about that.
Mm-hmm.
I have examples, but none that I can kind of whittle down into something brief. Um, so I wouldn't so much talk about a continuum as to say that no matter what your culture is, the gospel will absolutely challenge you and will scandalize the people around you, right? Jesus said, no one who does not leave mother and father and brother and sister and wife and children, or he says, all who, I forget exactly how he puts it. He says, those who have done this are worthy of me, right? Anyone who has not done this is not worthy of me, right? To follow the Lord is a scandal to the people closest to you. And also, to follow the Lord does not mean abandoning your culture and adopting a different culture, no matter what your culture is.
Yeah, well put. So for those that are interested in Orthodox Christianity, that are exploring it, they're at the inquire stage, what would be your advice to them?
Say your prayers, read your Bible, go to church. Go to church, right? If you want to explore Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, the way you encounter Orthodox Christianity is at the worship of the church. Go to church, get to know people at church, get to know a priest, and at some point, fairly early on, you need to make a decision about, right, every priest of the Orthodox Church is a priest of the Orthodox Church, of course. But at some point fairly on, you have to make a decision and say, all right, I'm going to stick with this community and I'm going to stick with this priest. I'm going to learn from this priest. Right? It doesn't mean you can't visit other parishes, but you need to have a relationship. So if you're interested in exploring Orthodox Christianity, go to church, get to know a priest, read your Bible, say your prayers. Yeah, if you want to read other books, cool. They can be helpful for sure, but read your Bible, say your prayers.
Well, it's a wonderful place to end it for today, Father James. So I want to thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. In the video description, there is a link to a Google form, and if you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, that's where you can send it. If you have not yet subscribed or liked the video, please do. That helps to push the video out to other people who may be interested in it, and I hope that you have a peaceful week. Take care.